Let's start with some numbers that don't add up. On April 15, 1912, the RMS Titanic sank in the North Atlantic. Death toll: 1,514 people. It's the most famous maritime disaster in history. There are movies, documentaries, books, and about 1,000 conspiracy theories about it. Now here's the kicker. On January 30, 1945, a German ship called the Wilhelm Gustloff sank in the Baltic Sea. Death toll: over 9,300 people. That's more than 6 times the casualties of the Titanic. And I'm willing to bet most of you have never heard its name before today. This isn't some obscure historical footnote we're talking about. This is the deadliest maritime disaster in recorded human history. Yet it gets less attention than the Kardashians' breakfast choices. Why? Well, that's a story about politics, propaganda, and how inconvenient truths get buried when nobody wants to claim them. Chapter 1. The ship that history forgot. The Wilhelm Gustloff didn't start life as a death trap. In 1937, she was Nazi Germany's floating advertisement for the master race lifestyle. Built by the prestigious Blohm and Voss shipyards in Hamburg, the same guys who built some of the most beautiful ships ever to touch water, she stretched 684 feet from bow to stern. She displaced 25,000 tons of Baltic Sea when loaded. This wasn't just any cruise ship. She was the crown jewel of something called Kraft durch Freude, which translates to strength through joy. Sounds like a yoga class, but it was actually the Nazi Party's attempt to show German workers what they could have if they played along with the whole fascist thing. Think of it as a loyalty rewards program. Except instead of airline miles, you got a cabin with an ocean view and all the propaganda you could stomach. Adolf Hitler himself showed up for the launch ceremony. Picture that for a moment. The most evil man in modern history, standing on a dock in Hamburg. He's watching his floating palace slide into the water for the first time. He's probably thinking this ship will carry happy German families on vacation cruises, until the 1,000-year Reich gets tired of boat trips. But here's where the story gets its first twist. The ship was originally supposed to be called the Adolf Hitler. Subtle, right? But fate had other plans. In February 1936, a Jewish medical student named David Frankfurter walked into the Swiss office of Wilhelm Gustloff. Gustloff was the local Nazi Party leader. Frankfurter shot him dead. He immediately turned himself in, saying simply, "I fired the shots because I am a Jew." Hitler attended Gustloff's memorial service. He sat right next to the dead man's widow. And right there, next to the grieving woman, he decided the ship would carry the martyr's name instead. Wilhelm Gustloff, named after a man whose death proved something important. Even in neutral Switzerland, the Nazis weren't safe from the people they were trying to exterminate. The ship that emerged from this twisted christening was actually pretty impressive, if you could ignore who built it and why. Every cabin had an ocean view. No windowless interior rooms stuffed with poor passengers like on other ocean liners. The Nazis wanted to show that their version of socialism would eliminate class distinctions, at least when you were floating around the Baltic Sea on vacation. For 2 years, Wilhelm Gustloff did exactly what she was designed to do. She carried German workers on subsidized cruises. She showed them the rewards of loyalty to the Reich. Families posed for photos on her decks. Children played in her swimming pools. The ship became a floating symbol of Nazi prosperity. Proof that fascism could deliver the good life to ordinary people. But we all know how that story ends, don't we? War came, and everything changed. The luxury liner was about to become something much darker, much more deadly. The ship that was supposed to represent the bright future of Nazi Germany would instead become witness to its final, desperate collapse. Chapter 2. From Paradise to War Machine. You know what they say about the best laid plans of mice and fascists. September 1939 rolled around. Germany decided to invade Poland, and suddenly nobody cared about luxury cruises anymore. The Wehrmacht needed every resource they could get their hands on, including one very large, very expensive cruise ship floating around the Baltic with nowhere to go. The Kriegsmarine, that's the German Navy for those keeping score at home, took one look at the Wilhelm Gustloff and saw opportunity. Here was a ship with massive cargo capacity, comfortable quarters, and medical facilities already built in. Perfect for hauling wounded soldiers back from whatever fresh hell the German army was cooking up in Norway. So the floating palace of Nazi leisure got her first military makeover. Out went the shuffleboard courts and cocktail lounges. In came hospital beds, surgical equipment, and enough morphine to keep a regiment comfortable while they bled. The ship that once carried families on vacation now carried broken soldiers home from war. It's like turning a Disney cruise into a flying ambulance, except with more swastikas and substantially worse food. But that was just the warm-up act. By November 1940, the Wilhelm Gustloff had found her true wartime calling, and it wasn't pretty. The ship was permanently anchored in Gdynia. That's what the Germans called the Polish port of Gdansk after they stole it. And what did they do with this floating palace? They turned it into a submarine academy. Now, this is where the story gets really dark. We're talking about U-boat training. These weren't just any submarines. These were the same U-boats that spent the war sinking merchant ships, passenger liners, and anything else that moved on the Atlantic Ocean. The Battle of the Atlantic killed tens of thousands of Allied sailors, and a good chunk of those U-boat crews learned their trade right here, sleeping in luxury cabins that used to host German tourists. Picture this. Young German sailors, some of them barely out of high school, bunked in rooms that still had ocean view portholes and fancy wood paneling. They'd wake up every morning, eat breakfast in dining rooms that once served vacation meals to happy families, then spend their days learning how to sink ships and kill people. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a torpedo. The man running this operation was Korvettenkapitan Wilhelm Zahn. By 1942, Zahn was in charge of training the crews that posed the biggest threat to Allied shipping in the entire war. These weren't just submarine drivers. These were the guys who would spend months underwater, hunting convoys in the North Atlantic, trying to starve Britain into submission. But here's the thing about war, it has a way of eating its young. By 1943, the golden age of the U-boat was over. The Allies had figured out radar, sonar, and how to hunt submarines with their own aircraft. Zahn's recruits were getting younger and younger, their training periods shorter and shorter, and their chances of coming home smaller and smaller. These kids were being fed into a meat grinder, and everyone knew it. The strategic importance of this floating death academy didn't go unnoticed. In March 1943, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz himself showed up for an inspection. Dönitz was the guy running Germany's entire submarine fleet, the man who would eventually replace Hitler as head of the German state. For about 5 minutes after the Führer ate his pistol in that Berlin bunker, Dönitz walked the decks of the Wilhelm Gustloff. He toured the training facilities, and probably wondered how the hell they'd gotten to this point. Here was a ship built to showcase Nazi prosperity, now crammed with teenagers learning how to die underwater for a war that was already lost. If that's not a metaphor for the entire Third Reich, I don't know what is. The first real sign that this floating academy wasn't as safe as everyone thought came on October 9, 1943. American bombers from the 8th Air Force decided to pay Gdynia a visit, and they brought high explosives as party favors. For the first time in her career, the Wilhelm Gustloff found herself under enemy fire. The ship took minor damage, nothing that couldn't be patched up. But the psychological effect was huge. This wasn't supposed to happen. The ship was too far east, too well defended, too important to be vulnerable. But there she was, holes in her hull from American bombs, proof that nowhere was safe anymore. The attack was a preview of things to come. As 1945 approached, the ship that had trained Germany's submarine hunters was about to meet the ultimate hunter. And this time, there wouldn't be any minor damage to patch up. Chapter 3, Operation Hannibal. January 1945. If you were a German civilian living in East Prussia, this was when your world went straight to hell. The Red Army was coming, and they weren't exactly in a forgiving mood. Can't say I blame them, considering what the Germans had done during their little tour of the Soviet Union. But war doesn't care about who deserves what, it just eats whoever gets in the way. On January 13th, Soviet forces under General Ivan Chernikovsky smashed through German defenses like a sledgehammer through wet paper. The Third Belarusian Front didn't bother with subtlety. They just rolled over everything in their path, backed up by Marshal Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front coming from the south. Within 10 days, they'd cut off the entire region of East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Do the math. 2.5 million German civilians, men, women, children, grandparents who remembered when Prussia was still Prussia, suddenly found themselves trapped between Stalin's advancing army and the frozen Baltic Sea. And everyone knew what happened when the Red Army got hold of German civilians. Let's just say the Geneva Convention wasn't high on their reading list. Grand Admiral Dönitz was facing the kind of decision that keeps military commanders awake at night. He could follow orders and preserve what was left of the German Navy, for some imaginary future battle that would never come. Or he could risk everything, every remaining ship, every trained crew, every piece of naval hardware the Third Reich had left, in a desperate attempt to save millions of people from Soviet occupation. On January 23, Dönitz made his choice. He sent a coded radio message to all German naval units in the Baltic: begin Operation Hannibal. It was named after the guy who crossed the Alps with elephants, which should tell you something about how impossible this mission was supposed to be. What happened next was the largest seaborne evacuation in human history. Not Dunkirk, that was just 300,000 soldiers over 9 days. This was nearly 1 million people, both military and civilian, evacuated over 15 weeks using everything that could float: fishing boats, merchant ships, naval vessels, pleasure craft. If it had a hull and an engine, it got pressed into service. But logistics are a bitch, especially when you're trying to move the population of a small country across a frozen sea while the enemy shoots at you. The ports were chaos, absolute chaos. Trains packed with refugees arrived every hour at places like Gdynia and Königsberg. These weren't orderly evacuations with clipboards and passenger manifests. This was panic with a timetable. Picture this, it's 20 degrees below freezing. The wind is howling off the Baltic, and families are showing up with whatever they could grab when the artillery started falling. Mothers clutching babies wrapped in tablecloths because they ran out of blankets. Old men carrying suitcases with photographs and maybe some bread if they were lucky. Children searching through crowds of thousands for parents they got separated from on the train platforms. And in the middle of this frozen hell, there's the Wilhelm Gustloff, tied up at the dock in Gdynia like some ghost from a happier time. The ship that used to take German families on vacation cruises was about to take German families on the ride of their lives. Except this time, most of them wouldn't be coming back. The loading process was a nightmare. In peacetime, with proper procedures and all the time in the world, Wilhelm Gustloff could carry 1,900 passengers in reasonable comfort. But this wasn't peacetime, and comfort wasn't really an option anymore. The ship's officers had a choice: follow safety regulations and leave thousands of people to face the Red Army, or pack everyone aboard and hope for the best. They chose hope, which, as we'll see, was a mistake. By the time Wilhelm Gustloff was ready to sail on January 30th, there were over 10,000 people crammed into a ship designed for less than 2,000. The official passenger manifest listed 6,050 names, but that was bureaucratic fantasy. Thousands more had simply walked aboard without being registered. Desperate people don't wait for paperwork when the alternative is a shallow grave in a Siberian labor camp. The ship's crew did their best, but they were working with a vessel that had spent the last 5 years as a floating barracks. The lifeboats were insufficient. The safety equipment was inadequate. The escape routes were blocked by makeshift beds and luggage. Everything that could go wrong was already going wrong, and they hadn't even left the dock yet. As Wilhelm Gustloff prepared to sail into the Baltic darkness, loaded with more human cargo than she was ever designed to carry, another player was entering the game. Somewhere out in those black waters, a Soviet submarine was prowling, looking for targets. And the biggest target in the Baltic Sea was about to sail right into the crosshairs. The stage was set for the deadliest maritime disaster in history. All the pieces were in place: an overloaded ship, desperate refugees, and a hunter in the deep. What could possibly go wrong? Chapter 4. The Hunter. Meet Alexander Marinesko, Soviet submarine captain and the kind of guy who proves that history's most important moments are often decided by complete disasters of human beings. If you were casting a movie about heroic naval officers, Marinesko wouldn't make it past the first audition. But if you needed someone to accidentally change the course of maritime history while trying to save his own career, he was your man. Here's what you need to know about Marinesko. By January 1945, he should have been in front of a firing squad, not commanding a submarine. 3 weeks earlier, his boat, the S-13, was supposed to leave port for the Soviet offensive. The offensive that would drive the Germans out of the Baltic. The submarine was ready, his crew was ready, but their commander was nowhere to be found. Marinesko had gone on shore leave in the Finnish port of Turku and disappeared for 3 days. Not disappeared as in captured by enemy agents or heroically conducting reconnaissance behind enemy lines. Disappeared as in drinking himself stupid and spending time with prostitutes while his submarine sat at the dock waiting for orders. When the military police finally tracked him down, he couldn't remember most of what he'd done. The Soviet secret police don't have a great sense of humor about this kind of thing. They suspected desertion, treason, or at minimum, being too stupid to live. Marinesko was facing a court-martial that would likely end with him digging his own grave in some frozen field outside Leningrad. But war makes strange bedfellows, and sometimes it makes heroes out of alcoholics. Marinesko's commanding officer needed every experienced submarine captain he could get. The S-13 was one of the better boats in the Baltic fleet, and trained submarine commanders don't grow on trees. So instead of shooting Marinesko, they gave him one last chance to redeem himself. The S-13 left port on January 11, 1945. With a captain who knew this was his final opportunity to prove he wasn't completely worthless. Marinesko was desperate to find something, anything, that would convince his superiors he was worth keeping alive, and desperation makes people dangerous. For nearly 3 weeks, the S-13 prowled the Baltic Sea looking for German targets. They found a few small vessels, nothing worth bragging about. Marinesko was running out of time and patience when, on the evening of January 30th, his lookouts spotted something that made their hearts race. 3 ships on the horizon, heading west. The largest one was massive, clearly a passenger liner or major transport vessel. This was exactly what Marinesko needed. a target big enough to make the Soviet Navy forget about his little vacation in Turku. For 2 hours, the S-13 shadowed Wilhelm Gustloff from the starboard side, staying far enough away to avoid detection but close enough for Marinesko to study his prey through the periscope. He could see the ship was heavily loaded, riding low in the water, moving slowly through the Baltic swells. She was a beautiful target, big, fat, and apparently unaware she was being hunted. Marinesko made his decision. Instead of attacking from the safer seaward side, he would take S-13 around Wilhelm Gustloff's stern, and attack from the port side, closer to shore. It was riskier. Shallow water meant less room to maneuver if something went wrong. But it also meant the attack would be completely unexpected. German ships worried about submarines coming from deep water, not from the coastal shallows. The S-13 slipped through the dark waters like a metal shark, positioning herself for the perfect shot. Marinesko had 4 torpedoes loaded and ready. His crew knew this was their moment, probably their only moment, to do something that would matter in this war. At 9:16 p.m. Central European Time, Marinesko gave the order that would change everything. Fire! 4 torpedoes launched from the S-13's forward tubes, racing through the black water toward Wilhelm Gustloff's hull. The first torpedo bore a painted inscription, "For the Motherland." The second read, "For the Soviet people." The third was marked for Leningrad, the city that had endured nearly 900 days of German siege and starvation. The fourth torpedo jammed in its tube and never fired. In retrospect, 3 was more than enough. Marinesko watched through his periscope as the torpedoes streaked toward their target. In a few seconds, he would either salvage his career or become just another Soviet submarine captain who missed his shot at glory. The drunk, the degenerate, the man who should have been court-martialed for desertion was about to achieve the greatest maritime kill in naval history. He just didn't know it yet, and neither did the 10,000 people aboard Wilhelm Gustloff. They had exactly 30 seconds left in the world they knew. The hunter had found his prey, and there was no escape. Chapter 5, 40 Minutes to Hell. At 9:16 p.m. on January 30, 1945, 3 Soviet torpedoes slammed into the port side of Wilhelm Gustloff with the force of underwater freight trains. In that instant, the largest maritime disaster in human history began its 40-minute countdown to hell. The first torpedo hit the bow section, and the ship's designer's best intentions became everyone's worst nightmare. Those fancy watertight doors that were supposed to save the ship in an emergency? They worked exactly as designed, slamming shut automatically when the hull was breached. Unfortunately, most of the off-duty crew was sleeping below decks when it happened. The doors locked them in their bunks like a steel coffin. They never had a chance. The second torpedo found what might have been the worst possible target on the entire ship, the drained swimming pool where 373 female naval auxiliaries were quartered. These were young German women, barely out of their teens, who'd volunteered to help with naval communications and logistics. They were sleeping in triple-tiered bunks installed where wealthy German families used to splash around on vacation. The explosion was catastrophic. The torpedo didn't just breach the hull. It turned the ceramic tiles lining the swimming pool into a cloud of high-velocity shrapnel. Picture a hand grenade going off in a tile store, except the tiles are flying at bullet speed and there's nowhere to take cover. Of those 373 women, only 3 survived. 3. The rest were killed instantly by flying debris or drowned in the twisted wreckage of what used to be the ship's most elegant feature. The third torpedo hit the engine room amidships, which was game over for any hope of survival. All power died instantly. Lights, communications, ventilation, everything. The massive diesel engines that had pushed Wilhelm Gustloff through peaceful Baltic cruises fell silent forever. In the space of 30 seconds, a functioning ship became a floating tomb. But the real killer wasn't the torpedoes, it was the Baltic Sea itself. January in the Baltic makes the North Atlantic look like a warm bath. The water temperature was 18 degrees Fahrenheit below freezing. That's cold enough to kill you in 15 minutes, assuming you could survive the shock of hitting the water in the first place. Here's some math that'll ruin your day. Wilhelm Gustloff was designed to carry 1,900 passengers with adequate lifeboats and safety equipment. She was carrying over 10,000 people. Even if every single lifeboat had launched perfectly, and they didn't, there wasn't room for everyone. Simple arithmetic meant that thousands of people were going to die no matter what happened next. And what happened next was chaos in the dark. With all power gone, Wilhelm Gustloff became a maze of pitch-black corridors filled with screaming passengers. No emergency lighting, no public address system. No way for anyone to know what was happening or where to go. Families were torn apart in the darkness. Parents lost children in the stampede toward the tilting decks. People who'd survived the torpedo impacts were trampled to death by their fellow passengers. The ship's list to port made everything worse. As Wilhelm Gustloff rolled over, interior walls became floors and floors became walls. Passengers found themselves crawling up what used to be corridors. clawing their way through twisted metal and rising water. Many never made it out of their cabins. They were trapped by furniture, luggage, and debris that had turned into deadly obstacles. The lucky ones who reached the deck faced a different kind of hell. The ship's lifeboats were designed for an orderly evacuation in calm seas with trained crew to launch them. Instead, they got panicked civilians in a brutal storm with most of the crew dead or trapped below decks. Some boats launched successfully. Others capsized as soon as they hit the water. A few never made it off the davits. They hung uselessly from their cables as the ship rolled over beneath them. For those who went into the water directly, hypothermia was both merciful and merciless. Merciful because it numbed the pain and panic. Merciless because it killed you in minutes. Most people who entered the Baltic Sea that night were unconscious within 5 minutes and dead within 15. The water was so cold it stopped your heart before you could drown. Wilhelm Gustloff herself died with agonizing slowness. The ship that had once symbolized Nazi strength and prosperity rolled onto her port side like a wounded whale, her massive hull gleaming in the moonlight. For 10 endless minutes, she lay there on her side, half submerged, giving false hope to anyone who thought she might stabilize. Then physics took over. The flooding compartments reached critical mass. The ship's center of gravity shifted past the point of no return. And Wilhelm Gustloff began her final dive. Though first, she slipped beneath the surface of the Baltic Sea, taking with her the dreams, hopes, and lives of over 9,000 human beings. The entire sinking, from torpedo impact to final submersion, took less than 40 minutes. In that brief span of time, more people died than in any other maritime disaster in recorded history. The ship that was built to showcase the future of Nazi Germany instead became a monument to war's capacity for random, senseless destruction. Above the wreck site, in the freezing darkness of the Baltic night, a few rescue ships raced against time to save whoever they could find. But for most of the 10,000 souls who'd boarded Wilhelm Gustloff that morning, the journey was over. Chapter 6: The Silence of History. In the freezing waters above Wilhelm Gustloff's grave, German rescue vessels worked through the night like maritime paramedics at a mass casualty event. The torpedo boat T-36 pulled 564 survivors from the Baltic Sea. The torpedo boat Luva rescued 472 more. Other ships, minesweepers, patrol boats, anything that could float and had room, collected the rest. When the final count came in, 1,252 people had survived the sinking of Wilhelm Gustloff. Do that math and weep. Over 9,300 people died in a single night. That's more than the entire population of some small towns, gone in 40 minutes of Baltic hell. It was the deadliest maritime disaster in human history, and almost nobody knows it happened. Here's where the story gets really twisted. Remember Alexander Marinesko? Our drunk Soviet submarine commander who was facing court-martial when he fired those 3 torpedoes? You'd think the guy who achieved the greatest maritime kill in naval history would be treated like a hero, right? Parades in Red Square, medals from Stalin, maybe his picture on a postage stamp? Wrong. Marinesko's superiors took one look at what he'd accomplished and decided he was not suitable to be a hero of the Soviet Union. Think about that for a second. The man who sank the largest enemy vessel of World War II, larger than any battleship, carrier, or cruiser that went down during the entire war, got a participation trophy and a demotion. They busted him down to lieutenant and stuck him with training new submarine crews. Marinesko spent the rest of his career teaching other people how to do what he'd already done better than anyone in history. He died in 1963, forgotten and ignored, probably wondering what the hell he had to do to get recognized for literally the biggest naval victory of the war. But here's the thing about the Wilhelm Gustloff disaster. Nobody wanted to talk about it. Not the Soviets, not the Germans, not the Allies. It was like a maritime disaster that was too politically inconvenient for anyone to claim. From the Soviet perspective, highlighting Marinesko's achievement meant admitting they'd sunk a ship full of refugees. Sure, there were Nazi naval personnel aboard. And yes, it was a legitimate military target. But 5,000 of the dead were children. That's not exactly the kind of victory you want to celebrate in your propaganda posters. West Germany had their own reasons for staying quiet. Wilhelm Gustloff had been a symbol of Nazi maritime propaganda, built to showcase the supposed superiority of the Third Reich. Talking about the ship meant talking about the Nazi cruise program, the Kraft durch Freud movement, and all the ugly history that West Germany was trying very hard to forget in the 1950s. East Germany? They were taking orders from Moscow. And Moscow had already decided that Marinesko wasn't hero material. If the Soviets didn't want to celebrate the sinking, East Germany sure as hell wasn't going to bring it up. So the deadliest maritime disaster in human history became a historical footnote that almost nobody bothered to read. While the Titanic got movies, books, documentaries, and endless conspiracy theories, Wilhelm Gustloff got silence. The arithmetic was simple. 1,514 dead gets you Leonardo DiCaprio and Celine Dion. Over 9,000 dead gets you nothing. But some people refuse to let the dead stay buried. Ein Schoen was 18 years old when he survived the sinking of Wilhelm Gustloff. He should have died that night. By all the rules of probability and hypothermia, he should have been just another body floating in the Baltic Sea. Instead, he lived to become the disaster's unofficial historian. For the rest of his life, Schoen dedicated himself to documenting what happened. He interviewed survivors, tracked down records, created archives, and slowly pieced together the story that nobody else wanted to tell. Through his efforts, we know the names of some of the people who died that night. Not all of them, thousands remain forever anonymous, but enough to prove they were real people, not just statistics. Schoen understood something that the politicians and propagandists missed. The dead deserve to be remembered, regardless of which flag they sailed under or which uniform they wore. The children who drowned in the Baltic Sea didn't choose to be born German. The mothers who died trying to save their families didn't vote for Hitler. They were just people caught in the machinery of war, and they deserved better than historical amnesia. Today, Wilhelm Gustloff lies on the bottom of the Baltic Sea, 30 kilometers off the Polish coast. She's protected as a war grave by international treaty. Nobody can dive on her, salvage her, or disturb the thousands of people still entombed in her hull. The ship that was meant to showcase Nazi strength became a monument to the random cruelty of war. There's a final irony in this story that's almost too perfect to be real. Wilhelm Gustloff was named after a Nazi official who was assassinated by a Jewish student in 1936. The ship built to honor that dead fascist became the grave of innocent people fleeing the collapse of fascism. History has a sense of irony that would make Shakespeare weep. The Wilhelm Gustloff disaster reminds us that in the arithmetic of human tragedy, politics decides which victims we remember and which ones we forget. But forgetting doesn't make the dead any less dead, it just makes the living a little less human. So here we are, at the end of a story that most people never knew existed. Over 9,000 human beings died in the Baltic Sea on January 30, 1945. And for 80 years, the world has collectively shrugged and moved on. The deadliest maritime disaster in recorded history gets less attention than celebrity divorce proceedings. This isn't just about historical trivia or naval statistics. This is about how we decide which tragedies matter and which ones don't. The Titanic killed 1,514 people and became the most famous shipwreck in history. Wilhelm Gustloff killed 6 times more people and became a footnote that most history books skip entirely. The difference isn't the death toll. It's not the drama or the human interest stories. The difference is politics. The Titanic sank during peacetime, in international waters, with victims from wealthy Western nations. There were clear heroes and villains, compelling personal stories, and nobody's national pride was threatened by remembering it. Wilhelm Gustloff sank during wartime, carrying German refugees fleeing Soviet forces, sunk by a drunk submarine commander who wasn't supposed to be a hero. Every government involved had reasons to forget it happened, so they did. But forgetting doesn't change the facts. Those 9,000 people were just as dead, just as real, just as deserving of memory as anyone who died on the Titanic. Most of them were civilians, families with children, elderly people who'd never fired a shot in anger, pregnant women hoping their babies would be born somewhere safe. War creates its own logic of acceptable losses and forgotten victims. When you're fighting for survival, you don't have time to mourn the enemy's casualties. When you're rebuilding after defeat, you don't want to dwell on your own suffering. When you're writing the history books, you emphasize the victories that make your side look good. The Wilhelm Gustloff disaster fell through all those cracks. Too German for the Allies to commemorate, too tragic for the Soviets to celebrate, too connected to Nazi history for post-war Germany to embrace. So it became the maritime disaster that history tried to forget. But some stories refused to stay buried. Survivors like Ein Schoen spent their lives ensuring that the death of Wilhelm Gustloff wouldn't be forgotten entirely. Their efforts prove that individual human beings can sometimes force history to remember what politicians want to forget. In the end, that might be the most important lesson from this tragedy. The arithmetic of human suffering isn't political. Dead is dead, regardless of nationality or ideology. The children who drowned in the Baltic Sea were no less precious than the children who drowned in the North Atlantic. Their stories deserve to be told, even when, especially when, those stories are politically inconvenient. The Wilhelm Gustloff disaster reminds us that history is written by the survivors, but it's experienced by the dead. And sometimes, the dead have more to teach us than the living ever will. Remember their names. Remember their stories. Remember that when politics decides who deserves to be mourned, humanity loses something it can never get back.